Thanks, Comrade. So in my session, I really want to double back on this idea that Comrade Cole talked about when they were talking with Basil, saying that the real goal of organizing and educating is not to teach people what to think, but is to teach people how to think. And when I think about teaching people how to think, I also want to emphasize that it's not the kind of thing that you just hand to somebody. You say, this is how you think. Instead, it's helping comrades to engage in the practice of thinking with certain guidelines. And so some of those guidelines have been laid out for us actually. And it's really sad and a reflection of imperialist propaganda that we experience here in America, that we haven't been exposed to some of these thinkers. So I want us to actually take a look at some of these thinkers who've already done a lot of the hard work of mapping out this way of thinking that is revolutionary. And this way of thinking that's revolutionary is specifically called dialectical materialism. So I want to take us there. Okay, so dialectical materialism is the foundational thinking tool of revolution. It's simple enough, but it is situated in a philosophical culture of Eurocentric reactionary thinking. And so the basic story of philosophical traditions that led up to the development of dialectical materialism is that Western philosophy had gotten to this place where thinkers were at an impasse, and they were saying that the capital T truth was either that the real world is what we can see and measure, which is like empiricism. This is where we get the physical sciences. This is Newtonian thinking. This is Hume's thought. This is Locke's thought. Or it's what we can think about the world, which is idealism. And this goes to thinkers like but back to Descartes with the I am. And so this basic tension is an argument about what's real and what's not real. Is my thinking illusory? Is the thing that I subjectively experience what's illusory? And the only thing that's real is the material, objective world around me? Or conversely, is the only thing that's real the things that I can manipulate and physically alter in the real world, and my ideas are all illusory? All of my subjective notions about myself are illusory. And so often this is referred to as the Cartesian split. Descartes goes through this thought experiment where he says, imagine that a devil has created all these illusions that I experience as the world around me. And so what can I still know to be true? And that's where he comes up with the I think, therefore I am. And this basic debate just follows from there. So we're talking about the 1400s all the way to the present. But there's this alternative tradition that emerges in the 1800s that picks up on this idea of dialectics, but says, actually, Hegelian dialectics are the right process, but applied incorrectly. So rather than applying this dialectics to just our ideas, instead we need to apply dialectics to our relationship to the world. And so this is where Marx picks up. So Marx picks up this point by looking at the relation between my subjective ideas about the world and the real world, the material world around me. And the clearest example actually comes out of an articulation that Mao Zedong gives when he's writing about on contradictions. So Mao talks about the idea of like a pair. How do you know a pair? How do you know what a pair is, or how would you know what the truth of a pair is? So he says, if you want to know the taste of a pear, you must change the pear by eating it yourself. If you want to know the theory and methods of revolution, you must take part in revolution. All genuine knowledge originates in direct experience. So if we think about this example of a pear, I go into my experience of a pear with no idea about what a pear is. I see this like green thing that seems to be some kind of a fruit. Maybe I've had an apple before, so I kind of think maybe it's going to be bitter, maybe it's going to be hard. And then I bite into the pear and it's soft and sweet. And all of a sudden I have this experience of the pear that refines my idea of what the pear is. And then maybe I go about my day and I say, I know exactly what a pear is. I know exactly what a pear is. Well, I come across another pear the next day, and that pear, I go to try it. I expect it to be sweet and soft. All of a sudden it's hard and bitter. So now the hard and bitter pear and the sweet and soft pear are integrated into a theory of what a pear is. So my idea of a pear is now changed. It's integrated these opposites into a whole. those opposites have become integrated by the object of the pair. And that might sound like an abstract or abstruse conversation, but I promise we're going to tie it right back to revolution. Mao wouldn't be talking about it if it didn't have relevance. So Mao writes in On Contradiction, explaining this process. He writes, rational knowledge depends upon perceptual knowledge, and perceptual knowledge remains to be developed into rational knowledge. It's only when the data or perception are very rich, in other words, not fragmentary, and correspond to reality, in other words, they're not illusory or false, that they can be the basis for forming correct concepts and theories. So again, just echoing this idea that we have sense experiences and we integrate those sense experiences into our theories. And there are possibilities that our sense experiences are so disparate that we can't connect them into a theory. And there's also the possibility that our sense experiences are illusions. But that doesn't change that fundamental relationship of experience and idea, experience and idea. In other words, material reality and our theory about material reality. So a lot of times you'll hear the dialectic of theory and practice. So why is this important? Well, this way of understanding how we understand has really huge implications for how we organize and what we believe to be true. And the nugget of those implications is to try to situate all of our knowledge in particular material circumstances. So to always be able to tie back our theories about the world to material conditions. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you a really clear sort of everyday political example that we might see now. Let's imagine that somebody wants to say that Black Lives Matter movement is a radical movement of domestic terrorists. We've heard this perpetuated in the media. We've seen it probably on our Facebook timelines. And let's imagine that they genuinely believe this is the case. So they're not just saying this cynically as a tool to make a point or to own the libs. They really genuinely believe this. Well, the question is, why are they prepared to accept this as a reality? And especially given that they live in the same world as us. So why are they willing to accept it when we're not? Well, often we're told that it's because they have been taught that this is the case, maybe by the media, maybe by their parents. We're told that the ideas that they have about BLM have been engendered through the other ideas that they've been exposed to. It's true to some extent, we're going to go back to that in a second, but dialectical materialism says, no. First and foremost, you need to look at the material basis for their thinking. In other words, you need to ask this question: what have they experienced in the world that has led them to this conclusion? So let's imagine a pretty typical white American settler experience. Number one, they've had a high degree of unacknowledged privilege that's been afforded to them by virtue of their whiteness. Number two, they've had opportunities for advancement educationally, economically, also by virtue of their whiteness. And number three, a cultural and material antagonism has been instilled in them from probably a very early age with Black Americans. And also the police have been, it's been instilled in them through experience that the police are their allies. They protect their private property. They protect their fiefdom. They've never experienced racism for themselves. They've never experienced profiling or harassment. So their ideas, or at the very least, the ideas that they're prepared to be receptive to, have been governed by these material experiences. It's not to say that ideas don't matter. In fact, the ruling classes have spent billions and billions of dollars and decades of research time, like they've used all of our social media data, for example, to figure out exactly what ideas we will be receptive to and how to package them in ways that we'll buy. But ultimately, they don't figure that stuff out by asking us what we believe. They figure that stuff out by observing our material interactions with the world. What are we buying? What are we watching? What are we doing with our time? And those ideas that they then feed back to us, they do shape our experience of reality. So for example, imagine our BLM hater, he's gonna show up to protests decked out in his boogaloo gear, and protesters are gonna be really angry and upset about that, and they're going to respond accordingly. But then he's just gonna use that material experience to reinforce his theory, his idea that Black Lives Matter is ultimately a terrorist organization. So my essential point is just to observe that in our political discourse, everyone's ideas are ultimately traceable in some way back to a material condition. But I promise those aren't the only stakes. They're actually much higher stakes for this. So threefold, I want to impress upon everybody the stakes of this theory of dialectical materialism. The first implication is that liberalism's prescription for more dialogue, discourse, etc., is bunk. At best, it's insufficient and misguided, and at worst, it's a cynical sort of way to channel all of our energy into exhausting conversations with reactionaries. The ruling class is not going to be convinced that it needs to cede its power because the material incentives for them not to are too great. In other words, no one's going to be simply talked out of giving up their privilege. People can certainly be motivated by discourse, but in general, people need to be rooted in the material. People will always be rooted in the material conditions that they experience. And so I'm particularly looking at this trend since 2016. Liberals, stop fact checking Donald Trump. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have any effect, and we've seen it borne out again and again and again. His supporters ultimately aren't concerned with the ideal coherence of his statements. It doesn't matter. What matters to them is, does he serve their material conditions? So a really effective point in driving this home is Walter Rodney's writing on bourgeois history. So we've all heard like the victors write the history books. Walter Rodney just drives this point home. And so Walter Rodney writes, bourgeois scholarship always pretends to hold a monopoly of truth and reason, and most bourgeois writers fall over themselves to stress that they approach issues open-mindedly and dispassionately. According to that line of argument, the Marxist has prejudged issues, has a closed mind, and is a partisan. It would therefore be unwise for the bourgeois scholars to expose his own set of assumptions, thereby revealing that he and the Marxists are following the same pattern of argumentation from established principles. But the premises are different and the methodology of analysis is different. So in other words, what I would encourage everybody to do, when pundits on CNN, you hear bourgeois politics, you need to understand that all of their ideas about the world, even if they're not cynical and manipulative, even if they're genuine, they're rooted in a particular experience of the world. They've benefited from this system. They've been rewarded for saying this particular thing. They've experienced some degree of comfort, ease, privilege from the espousal of this belief. So when you see, for example, that the Center for American Progress, which is supposedly a liberal bastion think tank, has actually revised their 2015 report to exclude stop and frisk, you could believe them that it's to focus more on anti-Muslim bias. But you could also look at the donor roll and see that $1.5 million came from the Michael Bloomberg campaign, right? Which has a vested interest in not having this story told. Why is it that Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, is in favor of repainting a street, but also tells federal prosecutors that she needs them to be locking up more people in DC? Well, it's not a mystery. Her position as a person of power and influence depends on mediating between a class of people who are terrorized by the police and a class of people who have the money, resources, and power to continue to get her reelected. And it's really that simple. This tool of dialectical materialism, Mao says, gives us the unity of opposites. It shows us that within the material existence of an object, we can see how contradictory things are true. We can't see it if we just treat the ideas, but if we look at the material existence, we can start to unify these opposites, these contradictions. So you always need to also consider this question that Cole brought up, this question that Lenin brings up, which is qui bono, Latin for who benefits. Don't get sucked into the ideas being espoused. Companies, politicians running sweatshops, paying black workers pennies on the dollar, funding private prisons, they've all come out and said that Black Lives Matter. And they've even given compelling discourses about why Black Lives Matter. The question is not their ideas, it's whether it's rooted in any material practice. So always we need to be looking at who benefits from this person saying this thing. But the third, and to my mind, the most compelling and interesting for all of us on this call is how it should affect our organizing. Specifically, I want to look at Paulo Freire's notion of the pedagogy of the oppressed. So many people recycle this text as in the realm of teaching, which is how I was exposed to it. But actually, like, I really encourage everybody to read it because it's a philosophy of organizing more than anything else. So without spending too much time on biography, Freire was an educator from Brazil who became involved in literacy initiatives and worker struggles throughout his life. He became a teacher because of his own radicalizing experiences, and in particular, his experiences growing up in poverty during the Depression in Brazil. So he wrote, "I didn't understand anything because of my hunger. I wasn't dumb. It wasn't lack of interest. My social condition didn't allow me to have an education. Experience showed me once again the relationship between social class and knowledge." But in 1968, Freire came out with a work entitled Pedagogy the Oppressed. And in that work, he lays out a critique of Western notions of pedagogy, which he claims are based on this banking model of education. And I think if we give adequate attention to his words on this, we'll see that this probably characterizes most of our educational experiences in America. So in describing the banking model, he writes, "Banking education maintains and even stimulates the contradiction through the following attitudes and practices which mirror oppressive society as a whole." So these relationships he's looking at bear out. A, the teacher teaches and the students are taught. B, the teacher knows everything and the students are wrong, know nothing. C, the teacher thinks and the students are thought about. D, the teacher talks and the students listen meekly. E, the teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. F, the teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students comply. G, the teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. H, the teacher chooses the program content and the students who are not consulted adapt to it. I, the teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she and he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. J, the teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. So he goes on to say, indeed, the interests of the oppressor lie in changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. For the more the oppressed can be led to adapt to the situation, the more easily they can be dominated. To achieve this end, the oppressors use the banking concept of education in conjunction with a paternalistic social action apparatus, within which the oppressed receive the euphemistic title of, quote, welfare recipients. They are treated as individual cases, as marginal persons who deviate from the general configuration of a, quote, good, organized, and just society. The oppressed are regarded as the pathology of the healthy society, which must therefore adjust these, quote unquote, incompetent and lazy folk to their own patterns by changing their mentality. These marginals need to be integrated, incorporated into the healthy society that they have forsaken. So in other words, Freire is connecting these Western schooling techniques to the material order of society. The way that our ideas are engendered is actually always to reinforce the material relationships. Pupils are taught in this way because it discourages them from thinking critically, analyzing their conditions, and questioning the status quo. Freire's thoughts have been echoed in countless sociological studies that actually analyze the class dynamics in different school models. So we see that, like in the United States, several studies have confirmed that poor students are exposed to this banking model and middle-class students are exposed to this banking model. It's only upper middle class or professional class children who are led to believe that they can actually write the rules. And what you see, funnily enough, is that the highest level, the owning class, is not taught that rules are immutable, but is actually taught that it is their job to carry on rules. So there's a weird relationship between class position and how people are educated. I shouldn't say weird because it's actually really straightforward given the material conditions. But what gets overlooked in Freire is the degree to which he is actually positing a theory of revolutionary organizing that is pedagogical. So his model of a liberatory pedagogy is one that is dialectical or dialogical. So students and teachers are co-creating understandings. Organizers and the people are co-creating an understanding through dialogue. Number two, it's materially rooted. So the students and the teacher are together, not looking at the ideas, but are looking at the material reality and then coming back into themselves to analyze their ideas or their theories about it. Number three, it's contingent. So knowledge is not fixed and immutable, but instead it's floating and negotiated. And lastly, it's based on praxis. So knowledge for its own sake doesn't really exist. Knowledge is always rooted in some practical question or application in the world. So I want to double back here on Mao because Mao's example of the pair is very useful. echoing like physicists' realizations with like the Heisenberg principle, if anyone's familiar with that. No one ever learns in the abstract. Mao points out that you learn the pear by eating it, by changing it. So we learn the world through our practice in the world. Knowledge isn't isolated and abstract. Instead, it does work in the world, and we do work in the world as we gain it. So what does this have to do directly with organizing? Well, there's two notions that I want to leave you with. The first of which is Mao's notion of the mass line, and the second of which is Freire's notion of the limit situation. So as organizers, I really want to encourage everybody to use these two frameworks as much as possible in order that we can be really effective and really grounded in the people. So Mao writes on contradiction, it does happen that the original ideas, theories, plans, or programs fail to correspond with reality either in whole or in part and are wholly or partially incorrect. In many instances, failures must be repeated many times before errors can be corrected in correspondence with the laws of the objective process, that's the material process, achieved. When that point is reached, the movement of human knowledge regarding a certain objective process at a certain stage of its development may be considered completed. It often happens, however, and this is his caution, that thinking lags behind reality. This is because man's cognition is limited by numerous social conditions. We are opposed to diehards in the revolutionary ranks whose thinking fails to advance with changing objective circumstances and has manifested itself historically as right opportunism. We are also opposed to left phrasemongering. The thinking of leftists outstrips a given stage of development of the objective process. Some regard their fantasies as truth, while others strain to realize in the present what can only be realized in the future. So Mao's caution to us, rooted in this idea of pedagogy, is that we need to be in conversation with the masses always. And we need to always be analyzing the material conditions that prevail, because if we don't, then we won't know where to push and will engage in tailism or dragging behind the people, waiting for the people to come to the point of revolution without figuring out ways that we can insert new ideas or push a revolutionary line. But people and saying things that the people aren't ready to understand or we haven't prepared the way for. So a specific quote on the mass line that I think is really helpful here from Mao. Mao says, "To link oneself with the masses, one must act in accordance with the needs and wishes of the masses. All work done for the masses must start from their needs and not from the desire of any individual, however well-intentioned. It often happens that objectively the masses need a certain change, but subjectively they are not yet conscious of the need, not yet willing or determined to make that change. In such cases, we should wait patiently. We should not make the change until through our work, most of the masses have become conscious of the need and are willing and determined to carry it out. Otherwise, we shall isolate ourselves from the masses. Unless they are conscious and willing, any kind of work that requires their participation will turn out to be a mere formality and will fail. There are two principles here. One is the actual need of the masses rather than what we fancy they need, and the other is the wishes of the masses who must make up their own minds instead of our making up their minds for them." So again, going back to this idea that Cole was saying, which is that we need to be working with people so that they can figure out how they think, not so that we can tell them what to think. So the idea of the mass line should always guide our organizing in this dialectical materialism. We should always be grounded in the material conditions, and it should always be a dialogical relationship, a pedagogical relationship. Freire also has some compelling writing here about how, as organizers, our job is to listen to the masses and their needs and conditions, but then to provide them with some of this theoretical exposure, not as a way of telling them what to think, but as a way of helping them to take what Mao described as those fragmentary sensory experiences and to connect them into a coherent whole. So in the same way that Christina was talking about housing, right? And we might think about our own housing woes as individual failures, a moral failure. Well, we don't if we have a theory of how housing is a feudal apparatus used to oppress people. And so that's where we as organizers can come in and help people to see that their potentially fragmentary sense experiences are actually grounded in a material coherence, in a theoretical coherence. Okay, but let's go to the second idea, which is Freire's notion of a limit situation. So Freire writes about a limit situation. Humans, however, because they are aware of themselves and thus of the world, because they are conscious beings, exist in a dialectical relationship between the determination of limits and their own freedom. As they separate themselves from the world, which they objectify, as they separate themselves from their own activity, as they locate the seat of their decisions inside themselves and in their relations with the world and others, people overcome the situations which limit them, the limit situations. Once perceived by individuals as fetters, as obstacles to their liberation, these situations stand out in relief from the background, revealing their true nature as concrete historical dimensions of a given reality. Men and women respond to the challenge with actions which Vieira Pinto, calls limit acts, those directed at negating and overcoming rather than passively accepting the given. Thus, it is not the limit situations in and of themselves which create a climate of hopelessness, but rather how they are perceived by men and women at a given historical moment, whether they appear as fetters or as insurmountable barriers. As critical perception is embodied in action, a climate of hope and confidence develops which leads men to attempt to overcome the limit situations. This objective can be achieved only through action upon the concrete historical reality in which limit situations historically are found. As reality is transformed and these situations are superseded, new ones will appear, which in turn evoke new limit acts. So in other words, we're always looking for the limit, the barrier, the obstacle, and trying to see how we can empower people, the masses, to overcome those things, to see those things as overcomable, and then to proceed to the next limit act. So it may be the case that we as organizers see a far off limit act, something like full liberation. The people themselves, though, are guided by immediate material concerns: housing, food, land, all the things that Don was talking about in his presentation about Fred Hampton. So how do we assist people or empower people, organize people to fight themselves to overcome those immediate limit situations, and through that overcoming to gain the confidence to struggle for revolution? So specifically, Freire has a great quote here about peasants realizing their power in organizing. So he writes, "It is striking, however, to observe how this self-deprecation changes with the first changes in the situation of oppression. I heard a peasant leader say in an assentamiento meeting, they used to say we were unproductive because we were lazy and drunkards. All lies. Now that we are respected as men, we're going to show everyone that we were never drunkards or lazy. We were exploited. As long as their ambiguity persists, the oppressed are reluctant to resist and totally lack confidence in themselves. They have a diffuse magical belief in the invulnerability and power of the oppressor. The magical force of the landowner's power holds particular sway in rural areas. A sociologist friend of mine tells of a group of armed peasants in a Latin American country who recently took over a latifundium. For practical reasons, they planned to hold the landowner as a hostage, but not one peasant had the courage to guard him. His very presence was terrifying. It is also possible that the act of opposing the boss provoked guilt feelings. In truth, the boss was inside them. The oppressed must see examples of the vulnerability of the oppressor so that a contrary conviction can begin to grow within them. Until this occurs, they will continue disheartened, fearful, and beaten. As long as the oppressed remain unaware of the causes of their condition, they fatalistically accept their exploitation. Further, they are apt to react in a passive and alienated manner when confronted with the necessity to struggle for their freedom and self-affirmation. Little by little, however, they tend to try out forms of rebellious act. In working towards liberation, one must neither lose sight of this passivity nor overlook the moment of awakening." So in other words, I really want to encourage us to think dialectically, to think in a dialectical materialist way, because I think it's going to help us to build power through our organizing. When we encounter people who've been oppressed, they're in dire circumstances and they've been fed all kinds of sick rationalizations for why they're in those circumstances. Everything from they didn't work hard enough, they're not smart enough, they're genetically inferior. Our white supremacist capitalist society has fed people these ideas. And so it's our job as organizers to constantly do three things as dialectical materialists: be in dialogue with the people, root in their understandings that they have of their own circumstances, understand that they know their lives and that they know their needs and that they know the conditions, the limit situations that they're confronting. Number two, help them to attack their own limit situations successfully. We can't go into a situation and put people in danger because potentially it will convince them for the rest of their lives that resistance is futile. And number three, provide them with context for understanding their material circumstances as related to the circumstances of other oppressed people and a constellation of systemic oppression. So I loved what Don said about imperialism and like the Rainbow Coalition and the need to connect different oppressed groups together. So the idea that this type of organizing, through this type of organizing, one can create that sort of rainbow coalition. So sort of to the question that was asked before, I think if we think pedagogically and if we think dialectically and if we think materially, then we'll be well on the way to that sort of victory. So let me pairs, which is great. Okay, I don't see any questions. I'll solicit, but I think that might be my closing. The last thing that I do want to say, is I want to say that Haesung raised a really good point in the chat during Cole and Basil's presentation about how not all of the critiques of China and the DPRK or actually existing socialism are rooted in imperialism. Some of those critiques are levied by people who themselves are oppressed and struggling in communist liberation struggle. And so I think with my reframing of the question from earlier, I just want to make sure that people understand that I made a pivot that wasn't genuine to the comrade's question and the comrade's point. And so the answers that Cole and Basil were able to provide, I think, didn't adequately address Haesung's point because of my pivot. And so I just want to engage in a little self-critique there and say that I apologize to the comrade